Hello! Today we're going to read Milly-Molly-Mandy Gets Up Early. Once upon a time, one beautiful summer morning, Milly-Molly-Mandy woke up very early. She knew it was very early because Father and Mother were not moving. Milly-Molly-Mandy's cot bed was in one corner of Father and Mother's room. And she knew it was a beautiful summer morning because the cracks around the window blinds were so bright she could hardly look at them. Milly-Molly-Mandy, whose full name was really Millicent Margaret Amanda, knelt up on the foot of her cot bed and softly lifted one corner of the blind and peeped out. And it was the most beautiful, quiet summer morning that ever was. The doves in the dovecot were saying "Coo-roo, roo, roo" to each other in a soft, lazy sort of way, and the hens around the hen house in the field were saying "Quack, quack, quack" to each other in a soft, busy sort of way. And old Marmaduke the cock was yelling "Doo-doo-doo" to everybody at the top of his voice, only it sounded soft because he was right the other side of the barn. "Well," said Milly-Molly-Mandy to herself, "it's much too beautiful a morning to stay in bed till breakfast time. I think I'll get up very, very quietly so as not to wake Father and Mother." So Milly-Molly-Mandy slid out of bed very, very quietly, and she slid into her socks and into her clothes as far as her petticoat. And then she crept to the washstand, but she didn't think she could manage the big water jug without waking Father and Mother. So she took up her shoes and her pink-striped cotton frock, and she creepy-crept to the door and opened it, only making just one tiny little click. And here's a picture of her sneaking down the stairs. And then she creepy-crept down the stairs without disturbing Grandma or Grandma or Uncle or Auntie into the kitchen. It looked funny and dark in the kitchen, for the curtains were still drawn. Topsy the cat jumped off Grandma's chair and came yawning and stretching to meet her, and Milly-Molly-Mandy had to stoop down and let Topsy the cat dab her little cold nose very, very lightly against her warm cheek for good morning. And then Milly-Molly-Mandy went into the scullery to wash. But when she turned on the tap, she suddenly thought of the brook at the bottom of the meadow. So she just washed her hands and neck and saved her face to wash in the brook. And then she put on her frock and shoes and softly unlocked the back door and slipped outside. It really was a most beautiful morning, full of little bird voices, and Toby the dog was making little thumping noises in his kennel because he'd heard her and was excited to think somebody was up. So Milly-Molly-Mandy ran and let him off the chain, but she held his collar and whispered, hush, Toby, very sternly until they got as far as the meadow. Then she let him go, and Toby the dog barked and capered, and Milly-Molly-Mandy, with the breeze in her hair, ran hoppity-skip down to the brook through the long grass and dewdrops that sparkled all colors in the sun. The water looked so lovely and clear and cold, rippling over the stones, that Milly-Molly-Mandy couldn't decide all at once which was the nicest spot to wash her face in. So she was walking along beside it a little way, when suddenly whom should she see in the next field but little friend Susan, up early too. "Susan," called Milly-Molly-Mandy. "Milly-Molly-Mandy," called little friend Susan, "there's mushrooms in this field." So Milly-Molly-Mandy and Toby the dog ran and clambered through the railings into the next field. And there were mushrooms in that field, for Milly-Molly-Mandy nearly trod on one straight away, only she just didn't. She picked it and ran to show it to little friend Susan and say, "Fancy you being up so early, Susan." And little friend Susan ran to show Milly-Molly-Mandy her 3 mushrooms and say, "Fancy you being up so early, Milly-Molly-Mandy." And here's a beautiful picture of them meeting in the morning, and Milly-Molly-Mandy clambering through the fence to meet her best friend, Susan. Then they searched all over the field together, but they didn't find any more mushrooms. And then they came to another field, and suddenly, who should they see in the middle of the other field but Billy Blunt, up early too. "Billy!" called Milly-Molly-Mandy. "Mushrooms!" called Billy Blunt. So Milly-Molly-Mandy and little friend Susan and Toby the dog ran and clambered over the stile into the other field and went to show Billy Blunt their mushrooms and say, "Fancy you being up so early, Billy." And Billy Blunt came to show them his 2 mushrooms and say, "Fancy anybody staying in bed." And then they found quite a lot of mushrooms growing together in one patch, and they all gave a gasp and a shout and set to work picking in great excitement. When they'd finished gathering, whom should they see coming into the field with a basket over his arm but a shabby boy who had run in a race with Billy Blunt at a fete last Bank Holiday and beaten him. He seemed to be looking for mushrooms too, and as he came near, Milly-Molly-Mandy smiled at him a bit, and he smiled a bit back. And little friend Susan said, "Hello," and he said, "Hello," and Billy Blunt said, "Plenty of mushrooms here." And the boy said, "Are there?" Then Milly-Molly-Mandy said, "Look what we've got," and the boy looked. And then little friend Susan said, "How many have you got?" And the boy showed his basket, but there weren't many in it. And then Billy Blunt said, "What are you going to do with them?" And the boy said, "Sell them to Mr. Smale the grocer if I can get enough. If not, we eat them, my granddad and I. Only we'd rather have the money." Then Milly-Molly-Mandy said, "Let's help get the basket full." And here are Billy Blunt, Susan, and Milly-Molly-Mandy picking mushrooms for their friend who needs them to sell to Mr. Smale the grocer so they can get some money. So they spread about over the field and looked everywhere for mushrooms, and they really got quite a lot. But the basket wasn't full. Then Billy Blunt and Milly-Molly-Mandy and little friend Susan looked questioningly at each other and at their own heap of mushrooms, and then they nodded to each other and piled them all in the basket. "My word," said the boy with a beaming face. "Won't Granddad be pleased today?" And then he thanked them all very much and said goodbye and went off home. Milly-Molly-Mandy and little friend Susan and Billy Blunt felt very satisfied with their morning's work. They had enjoyed it so much that they made plans to get up early another morning and go mushrooming together with baskets, for themselves this time. And then they all said goodbye till they should meet again at school. And Milly-Molly-Mandy called Toby the dog, and they went off home to their breakfast. And it wasn't until she got in that Milly-Molly-Mandy remembered she'd never washed her face in the brook after all, and she had to go up and do it in a basin in the ordinary way. And that's the story of Milly-Molly-Mandy Gets Up Early. And this book of stories was written, let me tell you, by Joyce, Lankester, Brisley. And here's the whole family of Milly-Molly-Mandy. She lives with all these people, and we'll have more stories about them. This story was written a long time ago in 1929, almost 100 years ago. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. There'll be more stories at Granny's house. Bye for now.